Othniel was born at a time when the people of Israel still carried desert dust on their feet and fresh promises in their hearts. It was a time of transition. Joshua had conquered the promised land, but the people were still trying to figure out how to live in it. Amid tribes, disputes, and memories of Egypt, a boy came into the world from the tribe of Judah, one of the strongest in Israel. His name, Othniel, the son of Kenaz and nephew of Caleb, the legendary warrior who, even when he was old, asked for a mountain to conquer. Growing up under the shadow of someone like Caleb was no easy task, but Othniel wasn't the type to hide. From an early age, he saw in his uncle more than a war hero. He saw a man who truly trusted in God, and that moved him. Othniel learned to fight, of course. Every boy in Judah learned, but he also listened. He listened to the stories of the sea that opened up, of the manna that fell from heaven, of the walls that collapsed in Jericho. With each story, something burned inside him. It was as if, even without knowing it, he was being prepared for something greater. It wasn't just a time of memories, it was also a time of forgetting. The people began to move away from the faith, to mix with neighboring cultures, to forget who had set them free. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with financial aid by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. But Othniel, he was different, quiet, observant, firm. He didn't attract attention, but he didn't go unnoticed. While the others sought safety in the cities, he seemed more concerned with the voice of God. And it was precisely this attitude that caught Caleb's eye when the time came to issue a challenge, a proposal that would change everything. A city surrounded by enemies, a promise worth his daughter's heart. And who would rise to accept the challenge was closer than anyone imagined. Caleb didn't beat around the bush. Already old, but with the fire in his eyes of someone who still dreams of battles, he looked at the people and issued his challenge. Whoever conquers Kirjath Sepher will have my daughter Achsah as his wife. Just like that, straightforward. It wasn't just a test of strength, but of courage, vision, and faith. That city was fortified, an enemy stronghold. Many trembled, others looked away. But in the middle of the silence, a figure stood up, Othniel. It wasn't with fanfare. He didn't need a speech, he just got ready and went, as if that moment had been written long before. With sword in hand and conviction in his chest, he marched towards the enemy city, and he didn't return empty-handed. When Kirjath Sepher fell, it wasn't just a military victory, it was a turning point. Othniel proved that he wasn't just Caleb's relative. He was a man of God, molded in faith and tempered in battle. Achsah, for her part, was no ordinary girl. Intelligent, firm, and determined, she saw in Othniel more than a winner. She saw a partner, someone with whom she could dream big. And that's how the two of them came together, not just through an arranged marriage, but through a shared mission. Soon after, when they were already living together, Achsah made a curious request. She turned to Othniel and said, "Ask my father for a blessing, a piece of land with water sources." A bold request. In times of drought and disputes over territory, springs were everything: sustenance, life, future. And Caleb, seeing his daughter's wisdom and his son-in-law's attitude, granted the upper and lower springs. On the surface, it looked like fertile land, but there, between the lines of this request, something greater was being born, as if God were watering the ground where, very soon, the people would need to flourish again. Achsah was not the kind of woman to accept anything quietly. She had her father's boldness in her blood and the wisdom of one who sees beyond. When she asked Othniel to talk to Caleb about the land, it wasn't just for comfort. It was vision. She knew that the future couldn't be built on dry ground. And Othniel, accustomed to listening before acting, understood right away. That request carried more than it seemed. At the meeting with Caleb, Achsah took the lead. She got on her donkey and went straight to the point. "Give me a blessing," she said, with the firmness of someone who knows what she wants. "You've already given me land in the Negev. Now give me springs of water." It was as if she was saying, "What we have is good, but it's not enough to sustain what God is yet to do." Caleb didn't hesitate. He handed over the upper and lower springs. A generous gift. 2 sources, 2 paths of provision. A clear symbol that God doesn't just give the minimum, but what is needed to overflow. While many were still trying to find their place in that new territory, Othniel and Achsah already had fertile land, flowing waters and purpose in their hearts. But it wasn't all flowers. The people around them were confused. Joshua, the great leader, had already died. The tribes began to distance themselves, each going their own way. The enemies, once contained, were now raising their heads again. And in the midst of all this, the people's faith began to wane. Little by little, like water dripping through the fingers, the covenant with God was being exchanged for idols, strange rituals, and empty promises. Othniel saw it all. He sensed in the air that something was wrong, as if a shadow was forming on the horizon. And this shadow had a name, and it was coming from far away. It didn't take long for the darkness to take shape. Its name was Cushan-Rishathaim, a foreign, powerful king from Mesopotamia. The name was already strange, heavy, as if it carried the very smell of oppression in its syllables. When he arrived, he didn't ask permission. He came with armies, shouts, and an enormous desire to dominate. And he succeeded. For 8 years, the people of Israel lived under the hand of this enemy. 8 years of shame, fear, and slavery. It didn't happen overnight. First, there were small attacks, then territories taken, and finally, total control. It was like a disease that spreads slowly, but the next thing you know, it's taken over the whole body. The people, once confident, were now downcast. The tribes, which were supposed to unite, began to blame each other. And the altars of God, which once had fire, were now cold, forgotten, covered in dust. Othniel watched everything. He knew that something had broken. It wasn't just an external war, it was internal too. The people had exchanged their trust in God for alliances with neighboring peoples. They tried to solve with politics what can only be fixed with repentance. And that's when the wailing began, first in a low voice, then in a collective wail. The oppressed people began to cry out. They cried out for deliverance, for help, for someone to remind them of who they were and who their God was. Meanwhile, in silence, something was also moving behind the scenes in heaven. God, who seemed far away, heard every cry, and in the midst of the people, among the plantations and the memories of ancient victories, there was a man. One who had already defeated a city, one who knew the voice of God, one who carried courage and calm within him. A name forgotten by many, but not by God. Othniel. On an ordinary afternoon, amidst the fatigue of heavy days and the silence of unanswered prayers, something different happened. It wasn't a noise, a vision, or thunder in the sky. It was like a wind inside, a breath that no one saw but which changed everything. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Othniel. It wasn't a passing emotion, it was a call, a force that didn't come from him, but filled him completely. An impulse that pushed him forward, like hearing one's name spoken with authority. Othniel didn't ask. He didn't offer himself, but he was chosen. God saw there an aligned heart, ready, and decided to use this ordinary man to do something unusual. Othniel stood up, and this time it wasn't to conquer a city for love. It was to free an entire people from oppression. He wasn't a king, a priest, or an army general. He was a judge, the first. A new title, an old mission, to be God's answer when the people forget the way. He gathered warriors, yes, but it wasn't just strategy. It was divine direction. It was knowing the right time to act, to speak, to wait. Othniel became the bridge between heaven and earth at that moment. While Israel wept, he moved with firmness. While everyone was looking at the enemy, he was looking at God. And then came the confrontation. The battle against Cush-and-Rishathaim was not easy. The enemy was strong, experienced, and cruel. But when Othniel entered the field, he didn't go alone. He carried with him the presence of the God who delivers. The same God who opened the sea, who brought down walls, would now bring down kingdoms. The battlefield was already armed. The swords would be raised. The people looked at Othniel as if something different was in him, and it was. Because on that day he wasn't just the warrior of youth, he was the judge raised up by God. And in the face of the coming war, the impossible was about to happen. The field was dry, the tension heavy in the air. On one side, the soldiers of Cush-and-Rishathaim, organized, well-armed, used to winning. On the other, the people of Israel, led by someone who until recently had looked after his land and his family, far from thrones and fancy armor. But something had changed. Othniel was different. He had the firmness in his eyes of someone who had listened to God and no longer had any doubts about what he needed to do. He didn't shout, he didn't make a speech. He just gave the order and went ahead. Like someone who knows that victory doesn't come from strength of arm, but from obedience to the call. The battle began with the sound of swords, the clash of shields, and that noise that only war can make, between dust, shouts, and heavy breathing. Israel fought like it had remembered who it was again. Othniel not only led, he inspired. And that changes everything in a war. No one expected it, not even the enemies. A people who had been oppressed for 8 years now attacked with courage, as if fear had evaporated. And Cush-and-Rishathaim, the invincible king, fell. There are no details about how or where. The Bible is brief, but the fact remains that he was defeated. With him, the weight of slavery fell. The people were freed, and for the first time in a long time, the silence of despair was replaced by the sound of freedom. Othniel, that man who did not seek the stage, became the leader who guided Israel into a new era. But it wasn't just the end of a war. It was the beginning of something greater. Because with victory came responsibility. And Israel, now free, would have to learn what to do with that freedom. While the people celebrated, Othniel was already thinking about what would come next. And time was beginning to move differently. The war was over. The swords were put away. The wounds healed and, for the first time in a long time, the people could breathe in peace. Not a peace made up of forced silence, but that peace which calms the chest, which allows you to sleep with your doors open and your heart light. Under Othniel's leadership, Israel lived like this for 40 years. 40. An entire generation growing up without hearing the cries of an enemy at the door. The springs requested by Asa now seemed like a sign of things to come. Good soil, running water, flourishing crops, children played in the fields without fear. The old men told stories without haste, and Othniel, God's chosen judge, kept everything in order. He didn't rule with an iron fist, but with justice and wisdom. He was respected, but more than that, he was listened to. When he spoke, the people paid attention, not because he shouted, but because his voice carried truth. With every decision, Othniel reminded the people where they had come from. Of the chains, the forgetfulness, the distance from God. He was like a living reminder of what happens when you walk with the Lord, and also of what happens when you forget him. And perhaps that's why the peace lasted so long. But time is a curious thing. It passes slowly, and what was once a living memory starts to become a distant memory. Children grow up not knowing what it's like to run from an enemy. Young people who haven't seen battle think it's always been like this. And little by little, comfort becomes carelessness. Faith that was once a flame becomes an ember. Othniel saw it. He could feel it in people's eyes. It wasn't fear or malice. It was forgetfulness, like a sky that begins to cloud over slowly, almost imperceptibly, and in the middle of the calm, something began to get lost in the air. Over the years, Othniel grew older. His hair, once dark, now bore the white of time, and his steps were no longer as firm as before. But his presence still weighed heavily. He was like an ancient tree in the middle of the village. Even in silence, he commanded respect. Only, unlike the great heroes who have their stories detailed, Othniel's end came slowly, without fanfare, without ceremony. The Bible doesn't say if he had a farewell, if he left any final words, or how he died. It simply stopped being mentioned, as if God had picked him up at the right time, after he had done everything he needed to do. Othniel didn't need statues or crowns. He was one of those men who make their mark more by the seed they sow than by the tributes they receive. And perhaps that is precisely why his story endures to this day. But it's strange that a leader who brought peace for 40 years disappears from the narrative like that, without many details. That says a lot. Sometimes the greatest achievements are not those that are shouted loudly, but those that are sustained in silence. Othniel was Israel's first judge, the beginning of everything. And even with so little space in the texts, his impact echoed for generations. After him, others would come, some with strength, others with doubts, some with courage, others full of flaws. But they all followed the path that Othniel blazed. He showed that God still raised up deliverers even when all seemed lost, that he still answered the cries of the people even when they forgot him. And that's exactly what happened once again. Because after Othniel's death, history didn't stop. The people, like a cycle that never breaks, made mistakes again, fell again, and had to be reminded once again of who they really were. What Othniel planted wasn't just peace, it was a model, a benchmark. After him, the judges began to emerge, each with their own way, their own struggles and their own flaws. Deborah, for example, came with courage and wisdom at a time when no one expected leadership from a woman. Gideon, insecure at first, ended up becoming an unexpected warrior. And Samson, well, Samson was strength without breaks. All of them, in a way, walked down a road that Othniel paved. He was the first to show that God could raise up ordinary people to do extraordinary things. The people of Israel were going through a cycle. It was always the same. First came blessing, then oblivion. Then oppression, the outcry, and then God would raise up a judge. It was as if every generation, God had to rekindle a memory that the people insisted on erasing. And yet, he didn't give up. With each fall, he sent a new chance. And the first chance was Othniel. It's funny how little he's remembered. He doesn't have long lines, flashy miracles, or soap opera twists. But without him, perhaps the book of Judges wouldn't have continued. He paved the way. He showed that it was possible to win without needing a crown, that it was possible to be God's instrument without needing a noble title. Othniel was the beginning of a pattern. When the people cry out, God listens. When God calls, he empowers. Although forgotten by many, the echo of his story still reverberates, because every time someone simple is used by God for something great, Othniel is there, somewhere in that inspiration. And that pattern isn't over yet. Because even after the judges, the kings, the prophets, God would continue to choose the unlikely, until a time came when silence would once again take over, a long time of darkness. And yet, hope would not be extinguished. The years passed, decades, centuries. The people kept stumbling over the same mistakes, like someone who lives in circles. Judges came and went. Some led with fear, others with blatant failures. But God still responded. He continued to hear the cries even when they came too late. And the essence of that pattern, simple and powerful, lived on. Every time the people fell, God raised someone up. Othniel was just the first whiff of a promise that would span generations. A foretaste of what God has always done, use ordinary people to accomplish unusual things. The spirit that came upon him that afternoon, when no one expected it, didn't stay stuck in the past. It kept moving. It crossed time. It inspired prophets, set kings on fire, sustained fishermen, and, further down the line, it would land on another man, in another land, with another calling. Someone who would also come without warning, without status, but with authority that did not come from men. And that's where everything ties in, because Othniel wasn't just a piece of history, he was a type, a sign, a reminder that God has never stopped acting, that heaven is still watching, that the same God who looked to a man from the countryside of Judah to deliver Israel is still looking today. It doesn't matter if it's a time of war or silence. The Spirit is still blowing, He still calls, He still raises. And if today we wonder what to do when everything seems dark, perhaps the answer lies not only in what Othniel did, but in who he became. A man who listened, obeyed, and went, who didn't look for a stage, but was found, who didn't want leadership, but accepted the weight of it with faith. And that's where his story pulls us closer, because somehow we all have a piece of Othniel in us. The question is, what do we do when God calls? Othniel's story ends as it began, without fanfare, without great applause, but full of meaning. He didn't seek fame. He didn't need titles or long speeches. He was someone who lived attentively. When the time came to act, he was ready, not because he was preparing to be a hero, but because his heart was in the right place. Othniel teaches us that it's not about making a lot of noise, but about being available when God calls, and He always calls. Sometimes in the middle of chaos, sometimes in the middle of calm. It can be at a time of war or in the silence of everyday life. What matters is not the size of the stage, but the response we give. Othniel responded with courage, but also with humility. And that's what made him so great, even though he was forgotten by so many. We live in a different time, it's true, but the call is still the same. At home, at work, at school, at church, God is still looking for willing hearts. People who, even if they don't know everything, will say yes when the time comes. People who choose to serve rather than show up. People who do the right thing even when no one is looking. Othniel reminds us that true leadership is born of service, that God's Spirit doesn't choose the strongest or the brightest, but the most committed, and that every moment of obedience can be the beginning of a new story for many people around us. In the end, Othniel's legacy lies not in what he achieved, but in what he awakened: faith, courage, and the certainty that God doesn't need perfect people, only people who are available. Because when heaven decides to act, He always finds someone down here to carry the answer, and that someone might be you. If you liked Othniel's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.